Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterism Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I really appreciate you being with me. This is video number 2 in our review and response to the book by Brian Hodge entitled Problems with Preterism. And, pardon me, I have to be real honest with you here. I mean absolutely no disrespect to Mr. Hodge. The book is a little bit difficult to follow. Perhaps I should say it's a little bit difficult to appreciate. And again, no disrespect at all intended. Because it is almost the very epitome of presuppositional in its approach to the entire subject of eschatology. The writer makes one claim after another without attempting to do any exegesis, just simply assuming that X, Y, and Z is true without even beginning to prove that X, Y, and Z are true. Now look, if you grant a person their basic presuppositions, okay? If you don't question, if you don't challenge, if you don't examine the presuppositions of someone and demand that they establish the validity of their position, then guess what? They've won the day. They have won the debate. But that's not the way a critical review of a doctrine should proceed. If you're going to say preterism is false because of X, Y, and Z, and you don't seek to prove X, Y, and Z, but you come down after simply stating your convictions concerning X, Y, and Z, and then you say, see, preterism is false. That's basically circular reasoning. Preterism is false because X, Y, Z is true. How do you know X, Y, Z is true? Well, because it is. Therefore, preterism is false. I'm sorry, you haven't proven a thing. Now, Mr. Hodge spends a great deal of time discussing apocalyptic language. There's a great deal that I would take issue with concerning his comments, but I want to focus on page 15. He makes 3 points, and he says, a few observations about apocalyptic speech would be helpful here. And so he lists 3 points to try to establish, essentially, that X, Y, and Z is true, and why preterism falls. Point number 1, apocalyptic speech usually focuses on the present situation in light of the future climax, whether imminent or distant. It uses the future end of the fallen world, presupposition number 1, by the way, but to continue. It uses the future end of the fallen world as a framework to discuss the past and the present, but the future end is not itself the main subject of the speech, which is often why a variety of conflicting images are presented of the future. Did you understand that? Did that soak in? Do you truly understand what Mr. Hodge is saying? What he is saying, based upon his presupposition that there will be a yet future cosmic conflagration to bring human history to its end, Mr. Hodge takes that for granted. And he says that apocalyptic speech usually focuses on a present to the author, on a present situation in light of that future climax. In other words, while a writer, and let's use Isaiah chapter 13 as a good example of this. Isaiah chapter 13 is discussing the day of the Lord against Babylon. Isaiah 13, 1 and 2. The burden of the Lord, again, which Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Babylon. Okay? That's who it's about. And it's about the day of the Lord. At that day of the Lord against Babylon, the sun would be darkened, the moon would not give its light, the stars of heaven would be shaken and not give their light. Creation is destroyed. Now, Mr. Hodges' position is, well, he's talking about the destruction of Babylon, to be sure. However, he is framing that discussion in light of the ultimate end of time. Here's a problem. Isaiah doesn't give us an at-hand statement versus a not yet or not at hand statement. Now, don't you suppose it would be good, proper, and helpful if an apocalyptic writer is writing about a local imminent event, but he actually has in mind the ultimate end of time? Don't you think it would have been really good if he would have said, this is at hand, but this is not? Let me give you, for instance, in Joel, the book of Joel, Joel chapter 1 and verse 15, the day of the Lord is at hand. Joel chapter 2 verse 10, the day of the Lord is at hand. However, something really interesting takes place. In Joel 2 verse 28, it shall come to pass afterward. After what? After the day of the Lord that was at hand. You got to catch this, folks. We got to honor this language. So you have two references, probably three, to the imminent day of the Lord in Joel 1 and Joel 2. But then, after discussing that imminent day of the Lord, Joel is given a vision of a day of the Lord that would come after that imminent day of the Lord. And Peter, of course, in Acts chapter 2, 15 and following, after the apostles are accused of being drunk, Peter stands up with the 11 and says, men and brethren, hear my words. These men are not drunk, as you suppose, seeing it's but the third hour of the day. But this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. And he quotes verbatim from Joel 2, 28 and following. Well, what did Joel 2, 28 and following predict? After that imminent day of the Lord, afterward, the Lord said, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. Your young men shall see visions. Your old men shall dream dreams. There shall be blood and fire, vapor of smoke, before the coming of the great and the terrible day of the Lord. And then he says, chapter 3, verse 1, in those days, what days? The last days. The last days after the imminent day of the Lord. Folks, it's right there in the text. All you have to do is read it and honor it. It shall come to pass afterward, and then in those days and in that day. Well, what is that day? First of all, once again, in those days are the last days. They are not the at-hand days. They are not Joel's present day. They are afterward days. And to reiterate, it is not about the day of the Lord that was near, at hand, coming soon and shortly. It was about another last days day of the Lord. in those days and at that time. He is now not talking about his day. He is not now talking about the day of the Lord that was at hand. But he says in the last days that he is talking about, the day of the Lord would be at hand. Two distinct days of the Lord. One is at hand, one is not at hand, but in the last days, when the last days would arrive, the day of the Lord would be near. And again, Peter, standing up on Pentecost, says, guess what? This is that. Peter said, we're living in the last days. And thus, what did he say? Save yourselves from this untoward generation. Folks, you see how critical it is to understand what Mr. Hodge is doing here. He's saying, well, these apocalyptic texts may well say that something was at hand, and it was at hand if it says it was at hand. However, you have to understand that in reality, they're actually talking about the end of time also. Where do you get that from the text? This is a classic case, ladies and gentlemen, of what is known as eisegesis. It is reading into the text what you believe. It is not drawing out of the text what is actually there. What is actually there is the day of the Lord is at hand, Isaiah 13:6. There is no, it shall come to pass afterwards, or it shall come to pass in the last days, that is present as in Joel. This is a very serious violation of proper hermeneutic. And what is ironic about this, of course, is that Mr. Hodges speaks quite at length in this book about the importance of proper hermeneutic. Well, I agree with that 100%, obviously. But what I see him doing is violating the very rules of hermeneutic that he lays down by imposing on the text that he examines, and he doesn't examine all that terrible much of them, so far at least. He just says, here's the reality of the text, and imposes that onto the text. Okay, point number 2. He says apocalyptic speech casts itself as prophetic literature as a literary device, not because it is true prophetic literature laying out a future chronology. As stated above, it often describes its predictions ex eventu as a literary device to vividly communicate its message. Hence, an author such as the author of the Book of Enoch, who lived in the 2nd century BC, projects himself back into the persona of the antediluvian figure of Enoch in order to, quote, prophesy, unquote, about the past event of the flood, and then to link it to the end of the world event that the author sees happening in his present or anticipates in the near future. I'm sorry, this is really confusing. It's confused and confusing. Now, point number one very important admission. Yes, it is true that Enoch is attaching to his book the name of the 7th generation from Adam. This 2nd century BC writer is taking that name and writing as if he is the 7th generation from Adam. Just read Genesis chapter 5. And he is projecting himself backward in order to project himself forward. Did you follow that? Did other apocalyptic works do that? Yes. But here's something very, very important to understand, ladies and gentlemen. This is a subject that a great number of people just overlook. Pseudonymity was, in fact, very common in the ancient world. That is, And when I say pseudonymity, I mean pseudepigraphal. I always have trouble pronouncing that word. You'll just have to excuse me. In other words, what I mean is someone takes the name of some prominent individual in order to give their writing credibility. Supposedly, everyone knows that it's not the actual famous figure that wrote it. This current author, this contemporary author, is just simply using that name. In other words, it's a fake author. It's a fake book. It's not legitimate. Now, I'm the first to confess that the Book of Enoch is a really, really, really fascinating book. Okay? Make no mistake about it. I've read it 2 or 3 different times. I still allude to it very often. It's very helpful to understand the 2nd century BC Jewish expectation of eschatology. And there's some things in it that are really helpful. Okay? I don't believe for a moment that it's inspired. And by the way, you hear people say, oh, the book of Enoch was kicked out of the Bible. No, it wasn't kicked out. It was never part of the canon. Now, did the Catholic Church add it later on to their own Bible? Yes, they did. But that doesn't mean that the majority of the early church considered it canonical. It's very, very important to understand. So as fascinating as the book is, as helpful as the book is on many issues, that does not mean, number one, doesn't mean it was kicked out of the Bible by the Catholic Church. Excuse me, it was accepted by the Catholics, but it doesn't mean that it was kicked out by the earlier writers. They just never admitted it into the canon at all. But secondly, here's something you need to know. According to the renowned historian, he's a skeptic to be sure, but he's one of the most highly regarded historians and scholars in the modern world. When commenting on this claim of pseudonymity or pseudogryphal, yeah, I'm sorry. What I mean by that is when a writer takes the name of a famous personage, pseudepigraphal, I think. I don't know why I have trouble pronouncing that word. I've always had trouble pronouncing that word, and it's pseudo-graphone. Compound word, pseudo, false, graphone, writing. I don't know why I have trouble pronouncing it. Okay, got to go on. So here we are, and Bart Ehrman says that in the ancient world, such writings were frowned upon. They were not just, oh, yeah, look at here. Here's a book that's got Enoch's name on it. Wow, let's accept this. No. If there was not strong attestation of authorship, guess what? As a general rule, you had to have the provenance of a book, you had to have the content of the book, and you had to have attestation to the very best of the ability. And that's why we have the Bible as we have it today. And a little digression here, I am sometimes flabbergasted at the attempts of the skeptics and the atheists to tell us the Bible, and especially the Gospels, are not trustworthy. You just can't trust them at all. Richard Carrier, Dr. Richard Carrier, that I'll be debating here in a very short time, October the 12th, 2024, has given presentation after presentation on why the Gospels are not reliable. You just can't trust them. The stories they tell about Jesus, false. Made up, conjured up, fable, fiction, completely. The reasons he gives for justifying that, to me, are absolutely illogical. They cannot be sustained. And I'm thinking about doing a video one of these days before long, after the debate, examining his reasons why the Gospels are not reliable. Let me hear from you if you'd like to hear that, or if you'd like to see a video on that. Okay. My point of it here is that Mr. Hodge is saying that these apocalypses that we find in our Bible were talking about imminent events when they really were talking about future events and the far off. They were actually, in many cases, writing ex eventu. Now, I want to focus here, and I've got to hurry. One of his key arguments here is concerning the book of Daniel. Next week, I am going to focus on his claims concerning the book of Daniel. For instance, I'm jumping ahead just to give you an idea of what I'm going to be examining next week. He says, Daniel 9:26 introduces a second anointed one and a second ruler. The interest of Daniel is in the Antiochene crisis clarifies the identity of these individuals. Onias III is the anointed one. His murder in 171 BCE marks the end of the 62 sevens and the beginning of the 70th seven. The ruler and his people who destroyed the city and its temple are Antiochus IV and his army. Both Jews and Seleucids added to the trouble during the 62 sevens, with the result that the trouble continued and intensified during the 70th week. Well, folks, I consider that statement, that paragraph, it's a footnote actually, to be full of more error than you could shake a stick at. It's just false to the core, so far as I'm concerned. Now, oh, goodness, I need to sneeze. So this calls into question his point number 2. So, passing on from that, point number 3. The amount of symbolism used in a larger apocalyptic literary works, as opposed to smaller units of apocalyptic speech that may be absent of the imagery, far exceeds that used in regular prophetic speech, which can be substantial within itself. Hence, an interpreter of the symbolism is usually provided with the work appearing as a prophet or an angel in order to guide the reader through any particular symbolism the author wishes to emphasize, precisely because he has not laid out a literal, exact, chronological and sequential fulfillment of events. Well, here we've got a problem. When an apocalyptic writer says these things must shortly come to pass, Isaiah 13, Isaiah 24, Isaiah 25. Isaiah 24 and 25 do not use the terminology of these things must shortly come to pass. That's interesting, isn't it? That's in contrast to Isaiah 13. My point is this. Many of these Old Covenant, Old Testament, apocalyptic texts do emphatically use temporal statements that delimit the fulfillment of those prophecies to a given time context. Now, later in the book, Mr. Hodge says, on Revelation, and we'll get there, on Revelation, well, the preterists really emphasize soon and quickly and shortly, but basically he's not impressed. He said that's not determinative. And yet here, in these books, he says, well, the writers don't set a time statement. Well, as a matter of fact, they do. Daniel chapter 12, in predicting the resurrection, in predicting the end of the age, the time when the righteous would shine forth as the stars, it is delimited to the time when the power of the holy people was completely shattered. Daniel chapter 12, verse 7. Now, you don't get any more eschatological, and you do not get any more apocalyptic than Daniel chapter 12. And yet here is a delimiting statement that says all of these things, not some of them, all of those things would be fulfilled when the power of the holy people is completely shattered. Now, as I'm going to point out next week, Mr. Hodge says, well, this was fulfilled in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, which is a blatantly false claim. I'm out of time for today, but I hope you can see where I'm coming from. Mr. Hodge imposes his hermeneutic and his eschatology onto the text of the Bible. He tries to counter the nature of apocalyptic language, all the while saying and admitting that there is an imminent fulfillment of that language, but in reality, the ultimate aim and the goal of that language is the end of time, but he does so without seeking to prove his claim. This is far less than probative. It is far less than convincing. Okay? Thank you for joining me. And by the way, do not forget this month's 2-book special. And thank you so much for your wonderful response to this special so far. You know, time's getting away. This month is getting away from us. But my 2-book special, Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, otherwise known as Sukkot, and Can God Tell Time, you're going to save $20 when you go to my website, DonKPreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Click on the banner at the top. You're going to pay $20 total price. You're going to save $20. Actually, you're going to save more than that. Okay? This is only good, U.S. orders only, and for the rest of September 2024. Now, I'm pretty sure I'm going to repeat this offer or a special on this. I'm going to offer another book along with it for October, but word of warning, it won't be this cheap. I miscalculated. I made a mistake. That's my problem, not yours. So take advantage of it. All right? Be sure to join me tonight with Mike Sullivan as we continue our study of the Song of Moses and New Testament eschatology. I'll see you there.